In this study we come to chapter 10 verse 1 to chapter 11 verse 10 of the book of Exodus. And first described here in chapter 10 verses 1 to 20 is the locust swarm, or the 8th plague against the Egyptians. The story begins, however, with some significant words in verse 2. The Lord told Moses that the people of God were to always recount to the generations which followed them what God had done in Egypt. And the reason for this is plain. Nothing encourages faith and obedience more easily than the recital of the character and the purposes of God. All too often believers leave this responsibility to others and neglect to teach these things to their own children, but to do so is to disobey a plain command of God. Few disasters are as devastating as a locust swarm. In countries where locusts sometimes appear, a swarm is anticipated with horror. Imagine then the unparalleled swarm mentioned here in verse 6. However, once again Pharaoh responded with an easy confession of sin and offered a shallow repentance which sprang only from a desire to escape the consequences of his rebellion. Like he saw before him and countless persons since, he could bring about no change of mind, though he sought the blessing with tears. A phrase we find in Hebrews chapter 12 verse 17. Christian preachers sometimes witness tears in their hearer when they preach the judgment of God. However, when that sense of judgment passes, the tears dry up, and the hearer's life continues much as before. It's not tears, but a changed life that shows true repentance. And this was clearly missing in Pharaoh. The first plague had attacked the power of one of God's greatest gods, the Nile. The 9th plague, described in chapter 10 verses 21 to 29, challenged the other great Egyptian deity, the sun. The plague of darkness would have been a real insult to Pharaoh because he was believed to be the incarnation of the sun god. However, this did not affect Pharaoh. His offer to Moses in verse 24 was a flat refusal to allow the people their freedom, since with their families and livestock still in Egypt, the men would have been forced to return. The final judgment upon Pharaoh was now inevitable. Moses' words in verse 29 proved to be wrong. They were rash words spoken in anger. However, they did recognize that the time for discussion had come to an end. They anticipate the horrifying finale of chapter 11. Until this point in the story, each plague has first been declared to Moses by the Lord. The description of the actual plague has then followed. But this pattern is broken with the final plague. Although it is described in chapter 11 verses 4 to 8, together with the Israelites' plundering of the Egyptians, the events are not actually described in detail until we reach chapter 12 verses 29 to 36. In between lies the description of the first Passover in chapter 12 and verses 1 to 28, and we shall see how important this is in our subsequent study. No society in the ancient world was more preoccupied with death than the Egyptians. The huge pyramids which still stand in modern Egypt show this. They emphasize how much time and energy the ancient Egyptians spent securing a safe passage through death to the life beyond. How severely, then, must the plague of death affected them? Of still greater importance is the fact that the Bible writers teach that death is the ultimate and final punishment for sin. Thus the claim of God to the life of every firstborn Egyptian was a clear declaration of God that the whole society was under his judgment for sinful rebellion. And thus, after reminding Moses of his earlier promises in chapter 11 verse 1, God proceeds to threaten this horrifying plague upon the Egyptians.